Kevin Costner's phone rang with a number he recognized immediately, even though months had passed since they'd last spoken. Whitney Houston's name appeared on his screen, and for reasons he couldn't explain, his heart began to race with an anxiety that had no logical source. He was in his home office in Los Angeles, going through scripts and emails, just another ordinary Friday afternoon. But the moment he heard Whitney's voice on the other end of the line, he knew this call was anything but ordinary. Her voice was different, softer somehow, stripped of the performative energy that usually characterized her phone conversations. She wasn't calling about work or a project, or one of the charitable causes they'd both supported over the years. She was calling because she needed to tell someone something, and for reasons that would haunt Kevin Costner for the rest of his life, she had chosen him. The conversation lasted 17 minutes and 32 seconds. Kevin would know the exact duration because after what happened the next day, he would check his phone records obsessively, trying to find meaning in every second, every word, every pause. At the time, he thought it was just a nostalgic catch-up call between old friends. A year later, he would realize it was a goodbye. 24 hours after that phone call ended, Whitney Houston would be found dead in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and Kevin Costner would spend the rest of his life asking himself the same terrible question. If he'd understood what she was really saying, could he have saved her? To understand the weight of that final phone call, you need to understand the relationship between Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston, a friendship that began in the most unlikely circumstances and became one of the most significant connections in both their lives. In 1992, Kevin Costner was at the absolute peak of his Hollywood power. Dances with Wolves had won him Best Director and Best Picture Oscars. He was the biggest movie star in the world, and every script, every project wanted him attached. Whitney Houston, meanwhile, was the undisputed queen of pop music, with a voice that defied description and a string of #1 hits that seemed unstoppable. They existed in completely different professional universes, movie stardom and music royalty, and under normal circumstances, their paths might never have crossed in any meaningful way. But The Bodyguard changed everything. The project had been developed years earlier with Diana Ross in mind, then shelved, then resurrected when Kevin became interested in producing and starring. The script called for a pop star being protected by a former Secret Service agent, and Kevin knew the chemistry between the leads would make or break the entire film. He needed someone who could bring genuine star power, someone whose presence on screen would make audiences believe she was worth protecting, someone who could sing the soundtrack in a way that would become iconic. Everyone told Kevin that casting Whitney Houston was a terrible idea. She'd never acted before, had no film experience, and the professional wisdom was that pop stars rarely translated successfully to cinema. His own agents and the studio executives all pushed for established actresses who could also sing. But Kevin had a vision that went beyond conventional thinking. He'd seen Whitney perform live, had witnessed the way she commanded a stage and connected with audiences, and he believed that raw star quality would translate to film. More importantly, he saw something in Whitney that others missed, a vulnerability beneath the confident exterior, a genuine humanity that would make her character Rachel Marin believable and sympathetic. Kevin fought for Whitney's casting with a determination that surprised even his closest collaborators. He personally called her, explained his vision for the film, and convinced her that she could do this despite her complete lack of acting experience. What began as a professional collaboration quickly evolved into something deeper. During the months of filming, Kevin became not just Whitney's co-star but her protector, advocate, and friend. He saw firsthand the pressure she was under, the constant demands from record labels, family members, managers, and a public that wanted to own every part of her. He watched her navigate the treacherous waters of sudden film stardom while maintaining her music career, and he admired her grace under impossible pressure. But Kevin also saw things that concerned him deeply. The signs were subtle at first, barely noticeable to outsiders, but increasingly clear to someone paying close attention. Whitney's energy would fluctuate dramatically from day to day. Some mornings she'd arrive on set radiating confidence and joy, delivering performances that exceeded everyone's expectations. Other days she'd seem distant, distracted, going through the motions with competence, but without spark. Her relationship with Bobby Brown, which had begun during the filming, worried Kevin from the start. He watched Bobby's visits to the set create tension and disruption, saw how Whitney's mood would shift when Bobby was around, noticed the way she became defensive when anyone questioned the relationship. Kevin had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize the patterns of a toxic relationship, and everything he observed suggested this one would bring Whitney more pain than happiness. He tried to talk to her about it once, carefully and privately, expressing his concerns as a friend who cared about her well-being. Whitney's response had been swift and absolute. She appreciated his concern, she told him, but her personal life was her own to manage. The conversation ended politely but firmly, and Kevin learned an important lesson. Whitney Houston would accept support and friendship, but she would not accept judgment or interference in her choices. The Bodyguard became a cultural phenomenon beyond anyone's expectations. The film grossed over $400 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 1992. But more significantly, the soundtrack became the best-selling soundtrack album of all time, with Whitney's rendition of "I Will Always Love You" becoming not just a hit, but a cultural touchstone that would define her career forever. The success should have launched Whitney into a stratospheric film career, should have opened doors to countless starring roles, and established her as a crossover talent who could dominate both music and cinema. But instead, Whitney's film career stalled almost immediately. She made a few more movies, none of which achieved the success of The Bodyguard, and gradually she retreated back to music, to touring, to the world she knew and understood. Kevin watched this trajectory with growing concern. They stayed in touch irregularly over the years, occasional phone calls and chance meetings at industry events, the kind of friendship that doesn't require constant contact but maintains genuine affection. Each time they spoke, Kevin tried to assess how Whitney was really doing beneath the public persona. Sometimes she seemed fine, talking about new projects and expressing optimism about the future. Other times he could hear the strain in her voice, the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something more troubling. The rumors about Whitney's struggles began circulating in the late 1990s and intensified through the 2000s. Erratic performances, canceled shows, visible weight loss, interviews where she seemed defensive or disconnected from reality. The tabloid coverage was brutal, focusing on every stumble and failure with gleeful cruelty. Kevin, watching from a distance, felt increasingly helpless. He would call occasionally, checking in, offering support, but Whitney had become skilled at deflecting genuine concern with humor and deflection. Their last in-person meeting before the final phone call had been at a charity event in 2009. Kevin had been shocked by Whitney's appearance. She'd lost significant weight, and her eyes had the tired, haunted quality he'd seen before in people fighting battles they were losing. They talked for maybe 15 minutes, Whitney putting on a brave face and insisting she was doing great, working on new music, excited about upcoming projects. Kevin had wanted to push, wanted to ask the real questions about her health and well-being, but the setting was too public, the moment too brief. He'd hugged her goodbye and said, "Call me if you ever need anything, Nip. I mean it." Whitney had smiled and promised she would, and Kevin had walked away knowing she probably wouldn't. February 2012 found Whitney Houston in Los Angeles for music industry events surrounding the Grammy Awards. She was scheduled to attend Clive Davis's legendary pre-Grammy party at the Beverly Hilton Hotel on Saturday, February 11th, and she'd checked into the hotel earlier in the week to prepare. Those who saw Whitney during those final days reported wildly different observations. Some said she seemed energized and hopeful, talking about recording new music and making a comeback. Others noticed concerning signs, erratic behavior, mood swings, and the physical toll of years of substance abuse visible in her appearance and energy levels. On Friday, February 10th, Whitney spent the day rehearsing for a performance she was scheduled to give at the Clive Davis party. The rehearsal didn't go well. Her voice, once the most powerful instrument in popular music, was a shadow of its former self. The effortless range and control that had defined her career were gone, replaced by a strained, inconsistent sound that frustrated Whitney and concerned everyone who heard it. By early afternoon, Whitney had retreated to her hotel suite, emotionally exhausted and increasingly isolated. What prompted Whitney to call Kevin Costner that afternoon remains a mystery even to those closest to her. They hadn't spoken in months, hadn't been in regular contact for years. But sometime around 2:30 p.m. Pacific time, Whitney picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and called the man who had believed in her when Hollywood hadn't, who had protected her on the set of The Bodyguard, who had seen her at her best and never judged her at her worst. Kevin was working in his home office when the call came through. He answered on the second ring, genuinely pleased to hear from her, but also immediately aware that something was different about this call. Whitney's voice lacked the performative energy she usually projected. She sounded tired but also strangely peaceful, as if she'd made some kind of decision and found calm in the certainty of it. The conversation began with small talk, reminiscences about The Bodyguard, memories of their time working together. Whitney asked about Kevin's family, his recent projects, whether he'd seen any of her recent interviews. Kevin asked about her upcoming performance at the Clive Davis party, whether she was nervous, if she was taking care of herself. The exchange was casual, affectionate, the kind of conversation old friends have when catching up after too long apart. But then, about 12 minutes into the call, the tone shifted. Whitney's voice became quieter, more serious, and she said something that should have alarmed Kevin but didn't register as the warning it was until it was too late. "Kevin, I'm tired," she said, the words simple but weighted with meaning he didn't fully grasp. "I'm so tired of being strong all the time, tired of performing, tired of being Whitney Houston." Kevin had heard variations of this sentiment from Whitney before, the exhaustion that came with living up to impossible expectations, the burden of being a legend when all you wanted was to be human. He responded with sympathy and encouragement, reminding her of her incredible talent, the joy her music had brought to millions, the strength she'd shown throughout her career. "You've overcome so much, Nip," he told her, using the nickname he'd given her during the Bodyguard filming. "You're the strongest person I know. This is just a rough patch. You'll get through it like you always do." Whitney was quiet for a long moment after Kevin finished speaking, and when she responded, her words would echo in Kevin's mind for the rest of his life. "What if I don't want to get through it anymore?" she asked softly. "What if I'm just ready to rest?" Kevin Costner would replay that 17-minute, 32-second phone call thousands of times in the months and years that followed Whitney's death. Every word, every pause, every shift in tone became evidence he analyzed obsessively, searching for the warning signs he'd missed, the moment where he could have intervened and changed the outcome. At the time, though, he interpreted Whitney's words through the lens of exhaustion and temporary despair, rather than genuine suicidal ideation. "Everybody feels like that sometimes," Kevin had told her during that call, his voice warm and reassuring. "The pressure you've been under your whole life, the scrutiny, the demands, of course you're tired. But that doesn't mean giving up. That means finding a way to rest, to step back and take care of yourself." Whitney had made a sound that could have been agreement or acknowledgement, and the conversation had shifted to lighter topics. They talked about possibly working together again on a project, reminisced about funny moments from the Bodyguard set, discussed mutual friends in the industry. By the time the call ended, Kevin felt satisfied that he'd offered support and encouragement to an old friend going through a difficult time. "Take care of yourself, Nip," Kevin had said as the conversation wound down. "And call me if you need anything, okay? I mean it, any time, day or night." "I know you do," Whitney had replied, her voice carrying a note of genuine affection. "You've always been there for me, Kevin. I want you to know that meant everything." There was something final in the way she said it, a quality of farewell that should have triggered alarms, but instead just felt like the natural end of a meaningful conversation. "We'll talk soon," Kevin had said. "Soon," Whitney had agreed, and then the line went dead. Kevin had set down his phone, smiled slightly at the pleasant surprise of hearing from his old friend, and gone back to the script he'd been reading. He had absolutely no indication that he would never speak to Whitney Houston again, that the woman he'd just spent 17 minutes and 32 seconds talking to had less than 24 hours left to live. Saturday, February 11th, 2012, began as an ordinary day for Kevin Costner. He had no events scheduled, no immediate obligations, just a quiet weekend at home with his family. He didn't think about Whitney's call from the previous afternoon except in passing, a warm memory of connection with an old friend. He certainly didn't know that at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, where Whitney was scheduled to perform that evening at Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party. A tragedy was unfolding that would shock the entire world. The timeline of Whitney's final hours has been documented extensively through hotel records, witness statements, and forensic evidence. She spent Saturday morning in her hotel suite, speaking with her daughter Bobby Christina, making phone calls to friends and family, preparing for the evening's performance. Around noon, she went to the hotel gym for a brief workout, then returned to her room. Sometime around 3:00 p.m. Pacific time, Whitney drew a bath in her suite's bathroom, a habit she'd had for years as a way to relax before performances. What happened next would never be fully understood. Whether it was accidental or intentional, whether it was a moment of carelessness or a final surrender to the exhaustion she'd expressed to Kevin just one day earlier, Whitney Houston slipped beneath the water in that bathtub and never resurfaced. Her body was discovered by her personal assistant at approximately 3:35 p.m. Emergency services were called immediately, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. At 3:55 p.m. Pacific time, Whitney Houston was pronounced dead at the age of 48. The news broke slowly at first, circulating as unconfirmed rumors through the music industry gathering at the Beverly Hilton. Clive Davis, Whitney's mentor and the host of the evening's party, faced an impossible decision: cancel the event as a mark of respect or proceed as a tribute to Whitney's memory. He chose to proceed, transforming the celebration into a memorial, and the evening became a surreal mixture of grief and performance as music's biggest names tried to process the loss. Kevin Costner wasn't at the party, wasn't part of the music industry inner circle that received the news first. He learned about Whitney's death the way millions of other people did, through breaking news alerts on television and phone calls from concerned friends. He was at home when his phone began ringing with calls from people who knew about his friendship with Whitney, who wanted to know if he'd heard, if he had any information, how he was handling the news. The initial shock was overwhelming, the disbelief that comes when reality refuses to align with what your mind can accept. Kevin's first thought was that there must be a mistake, that the reports were exaggerated or incorrect. Whitney couldn't be dead. He just talked to her yesterday. She'd sounded tired but not desperate, melancholy but not hopeless. How could someone go from a normal phone conversation to dead in less than 24 hours? But as the confirmation came through official channels, as the details began to emerge about how and where she'd been found, the terrible reality set in. Whitney Houston was gone, and Kevin Costner's last conversation with her suddenly took on a completely different meaning. Every word she'd said, every pause, every shift in tone became evidence of a farewell he hadn't recognized. "I'm tired of being strong. What if I don't want to get through it anymore? I want you to know that meant everything." These weren't just expressions of exhaustion. They were messages, attempts to tell him something he'd failed to hear. The guilt hit Kevin like a physical blow, crushing and absolute. In the days following Whitney's death, Kevin Costner existed in a fog of grief and guilt that threatened to overwhelm him completely. He replayed that final phone call constantly, analyzing every word, searching for the moment where he should have known, should have acted, should have done something different. Friends and family tried to comfort him, reminding him that Whitney's struggles had been long-standing and complex, that no single conversation could have changed the trajectory she was on, that he'd offered genuine support and encouragement when she'd reached out. But Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that he'd failed his friend when she needed him most. He'd been given a chance to help her, and he'd offered platitudes instead of intervention. He'd heard her cry for help and mistaken it for temporary sadness. The question that haunted him most was whether Whitney's death had been accidental or intentional. The official cause of death was drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. But the ambiguity of those findings left room for interpretation. Had Whitney simply fallen asleep in the bath due to exhaustion and substance use? Or had she made a conscious choice to surrender to the water, to finally find the rest she'd told Kevin she was desperate for? The funeral was held on February 18, 2012, at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, the same church where Whitney had sung as a child and discovered her extraordinary voice. Kevin Costner was asked to speak at the service, to share his memories of Whitney and represent their friendship before an audience that would include Whitney's family, music industry legends, and millions watching the televised coverage around the world. Writing that eulogy became an exercise in confronting his own grief and guilt while trying to honor Whitney's memory with honesty and love. Kevin spent days crafting his remarks, struggling to find words that would capture the complexity of who Whitney had been, the brilliance and the struggle, the strength and the vulnerability. When he finally stood at the pulpit in New Hope Baptist Church to deliver his eulogy, Kevin Costner did something remarkable. Instead of offering the sanitized, reverent memorial that many expected, he spoke with raw honesty about Whitney's humanity. He talked about her insecurities despite her incredible talent, her need for reassurance even as she stood at the pinnacle of success, the way she doubted herself when the entire world was celebrating her gifts. He spoke about the Bodyguard, about fighting to cast her when everyone said it was a mistake, about watching her overcome her fear and deliver a performance that would define both their careers. He talked about her laughter, her warmth, the way she'd made everyone around her feel seen and valued. And then, his voice breaking with emotion, Kevin revealed something he'd never shared publicly before. He talked about their final phone conversation, about Whitney telling him she was tired, about his failure to understand what she was really saying. "I thought I was being encouraging," Kevin said, his words carrying across the silent church. "I thought I was reminding her of her strength and resilience, but what Whitney needed wasn't encouragement to keep fighting. She needed permission to rest, to step away, to be something other than Whitney Houston for a while, and I didn't give her that." The congregation was silent, many people crying openly as they watched Kevin Costner publicly process his grief and regret. "The truth is," he continued, "we all failed Whitney in some way. We loved her talent more than we loved her. We wanted her voice, her performances, her star power, and we forgot that underneath all of that was just a woman who needed the same things we all need. To be seen, to be valued for who she was rather than what she could do, to rest when she was tired without being told she was letting people down." In the years since Whitney Houston's death, Kevin Costner has spoken occasionally about his friendship with her and the lasting impact of that final phone call. He's been remarkably candid about his struggle with guilt, about the therapy and self-reflection required to process the loss and forgive himself for the things he didn't say or do. In interviews, he's talked about how Whitney's death changed his approach to friendship and his understanding of what it means to truly support someone who's struggling. "I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is listen without trying to fix," Kevin said in a 2015 interview. "When Whitney told me she was tired, I should have just heard that, sat with it, let her express that exhaustion without immediately jumping to solutions and encouragement. Sometimes people don't need you to save them. They just need you to witness their pain." That lesson has informed not just Kevin's personal relationships, but his public advocacy around mental health and addiction. He's become involved with several organizations focused on providing support for people in the entertainment industry, recognizing that the same pressures Whitney faced continue to affect countless performers and artists. The recording of Whitney's Super Bowl national anthem performance, which had become iconic in 1991, experienced a resurgence after her death, with millions of people revisiting that moment of absolute vocal perfection. For Kevin, watching that performance now carries additional weight, knowing what he knows about the cost of that perfection, the pressure to always deliver, the impossible standard Whitney set for herself and could never escape. The Bodyguard, the film that brought them together, has also taken on new meaning in the years since Whitney's death. The story of a protector who keeps his client safe from external threats while being unable to save her from her own self-destructive impulses seems tragically prophetic now. Kevin has said that he can't watch the film anymore without thinking about how the fiction mirrored the reality in ways he never anticipated. In 2017, on the 5th anniversary of Whitney's death, Kevin wrote an essay about their friendship that was published in several major outlets. In it, he reflected on the nature of fame and the special burden it places on those who achieve it at the highest levels. "Whitney wasn't destroyed by drugs or bad relationships or any of the things the tabloids focused on," he wrote. "She was destroyed by the weight of being Whitney Houston, by the impossible expectation that she would always be extraordinary, that she would never be tired or sad or simply human. We worshipped her talent and forgot she was a person. And when she tried to tell us she couldn't carry that weight anymore, we told her to be strong instead of offering to help carry the load." The question that haunts Kevin Costner and everyone else who loved Whitney Houston is whether her death could have been prevented. If Kevin had understood the true meaning behind Whitney's words during that final phone call, if he'd recognized her exhaustion as something more dangerous than temporary sadness, could he have intervened in a way that would have changed the outcome? The honest answer, the one Kevin has come to accept through years of therapy and reflection, is probably not. Whitney's struggles were deep, complex, and long-standing, the result of decades of pressure, trauma, and self-medication. One phone call, one intervention, one moment of recognition wouldn't have been enough to reverse a trajectory that had been building for years. But that rational understanding doesn't eliminate the emotional weight of those final words. "I'm tired of being strong. What if I don't want to get through it anymore?" These weren't just passing comments. They were Whitney's attempt to tell someone that she was drowning, that the performance she'd maintained for so long was becoming impossible to sustain. And while Kevin's response was well-intentioned and came from a place of genuine care, it was also the response of someone who didn't fully grasp the depth of her exhaustion. The tragedy of Whitney Houston's death isn't just that the world lost an extraordinary talent. It's that a woman who spent her entire life giving everything to others couldn't find a way to ask for what she needed for herself. The tragedy is that she reached out to someone she trusted, tried to express her desperate tiredness, and received encouragement to keep going when what she really needed was permission to stop. Kevin Costner lives with that knowledge every day, carries it as a weight that has shaped how he approaches every relationship, every friendship, every interaction with someone who seems to be struggling. He can't undo the past or change what happened on February 11th, 2012. But he can honor Whitney's memory by sharing the lessons of that final phone call, by helping others recognize the warning signs he missed, by encouraging a culture where admitting exhaustion is seen as strength rather than weakness. Whitney Houston's voice has been silent for over a decade now, but the echo of her final words to Kevin Costner continues to resonate. "I'm tired." Two simple words that contained a universe of pain, a plea for understanding, a goodbye disguised as conversation. If we listen to those words, truly hear them, perhaps we can prevent other talented, struggling souls from drowning while the world watches and applauds their performance. If this story of friendship, loss, and the importance of truly hearing each other moved you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who might be struggling, who might need to hear that it's okay to be tired, that asking for help is strength, not weakness. Whitney Houston's legacy isn't just her incredible voice and unforgettable performances. It's the reminder that behind every public figure, every performer, every person who seems to have it all together, there's a human being who sometimes just needs to be heard without judgment or solutions. Let us know in the comments. How can we do better at truly listening to the people in our lives? What can we learn from Kevin and Whitney's final conversation? Together, we can create a culture where no one has to suffer in silence, where exhaustion is met with compassion rather than encouragement to push through. Until next time, remember, the most loving thing you can do is sometimes just to listen.